Hi, I'm David Hildebrand, professor and chair of philosophy at the University of Colorado, Denver. I'm really glad to be here with you talking about a piece of mind that I've loved for a long time. It's called Solidarity or Objectivity by Richard Rorty. So I want to go over sort of the basic points of the article with you, and hopefully we'll have a chance to talk about more of them as time goes by. So the lecture is going to proceed in this way. First, we'll talk about the two ways that Rorty says we make sense of our lives, realism or pragmatism. Then we'll look at the realism side first, the desire for objectivity, and ask where did these ideas of objectivity come from. Then we'll talk about pragmatists who don't follow the realist approach. Rather, they're more likely to ground objectivity in solidarity. We'll look at an important criticism of pragmatism in Rorty's view, namely that it's a form of relativism, and Rorty will break that down and explain why the realists worry about pragmatism. Finally, we come around to the idea of what's the ethical or political upshot? Why is Rorty writing this? What's at stake? And finally, we'll talk at the end about a couple of metaphysical comforts that Rorty says are removed by pragmatism and why they are good riddance. So, Rorty's solidarity or objectivity begins with a contrast between pragmatism on the one hand and realism on the other. And the way he, I think, frames it for us is as follows. He says, there are two different ways in which reflective beings like us try to give sense to their lives. On the one hand, there's realism, right? We try to figure out how we stand objectively to a non-human reality. On the other hand, there's pragmatism. This is where we try to seek out friends or allies and those who can contribute to our sense of community or solidarity. In other words, we get a sense of our lives by who we're in communication with. So let's talk about each of these alternatives, and I think it'll become clear by the end of the lecture why Rorty prefers pragmatism over realism. Let's start with the desire for objectivity or realism. Typically, we see this framed as a stable notion of human nature, right, rather than in terms of popular opinion. Because after all, popular opinion is provincial, it's parochial, it changes, and it might not correspond to reality. To advance their positions, realists like to try to construct a metaphysics or an epistemology, a story of how we know things or what the world is like, and this will support the idea that what we consider to be true consists in a correspondence between our words or our ideas and the world. Or it might support their claim that when we justify what we're saying, we are justifying it by connection to something natural, something that really exists in the natural world. So Rorty says we have to ask where these ideas came from. And he points out that these realist desires for objectivity have a history. For example, in ancient Greek philosophy, thinkers were motivated by a fear of parochialism, a fear of provincialism. And this was a realization that they had, prompted by evidence that they saw happening around them in other parts of their world, differences, diversity. And so this leads to a kind of uncertainty about identity, and this gave them a way, objectivity or reaching for objectivity gave them a way to not be too provincial on the one hand, but not having to abandon themselves to all of the differences which were outside of them. In the Enlightenment period, this move towards objectivity was taken up by science. Science made scientists the paradigm of the intellectual who was engaged in a detached search for truth about the world, about human beings, and so forth. Now, in contrast, Rorty shows us, or argues rather, that pragmatists don't follow this path, right? That they don't follow a path which would try to stabilize our sense of ourselves in terms of some reality that's beyond us, right? Radically beyond us. Rather, they're the ones who would ground objectivity in solidarity. The pragmatist, as Rorty is defining him or her, doesn't see the need for a metaphysics or an epistemology as the machinery, right, for grounding a stability of knowledge, of opinion, right? In fact, there is no hard and fast distinction between knowledge and opinion for Rorty. It's a distinction really between topics on which it's easy to get agreement and topics where it's very hard to get agreement. That's what it comes down to for him. So, in other words, for Rorty, as for some other pragmatists like William James, truth is what's good for us to believe, where for Rorty, us is a category of people who share views, who share community, who share a culture, but it's not parochial and it's not absolutely fixed. It's flexible, it's expandable, right? It's open to argument. Now, Rorty considers in his argument, in his piece, the common accusation against pragmatists, namely that they're relativists. Right? Realists worry that pragmatism is hopelessly relativistic. So Rorty says, let's consider three common meanings of relativism. Right? One meaning of relativism is that every belief is as good as every other. And Rorty thinks this is clearly a self-defeating view. Another meaning of relativism is that the meaning of the term true is an equivocal term, right? In other words, it has as many meanings as there are procedures of justification. It could be true by definition, it could be true by extension, it could be true by popular vote, and so forth. Now, in contrast, Rorty thinks that the meaning of the word true is relatively univocal, but it's in the sense of indexicals, as if you might say here or there, or you or I can point at or refer to different things. So for Rorty, the term true is an indexical word that means it just points at different procedures of justification. Finally, a third meaning for relativism is that it means that there's nothing that can be said either about truth or about rationality, apart from describing whichever familiar procedures of justification a given society, say ours, uses in some area of inquiry. Now, Rorty endorses this, what he calls ethnocentric view, but he denies that it's a relativism. And we have to be careful here. By ethnocentrism, Rorty is not talking about a traditional ethnocentrism which just says that our views, the views of our ethnos, are right and everyone else is wrong. It's not just another correspondence to reality kind of view, where the reality in that case is the ethnos. No, his sense of ethnos is much broader, it's much more defeasible, much more fallible. Unlike relativism, too, it's not a theory at all. Right, this version of relativism that he's going to support. It's not really even a theory. It's more of an attitude. So Rorty's point here is that pragmatists are using the word true as one might use the word thanks. It's a compliment that one pays to sentences that are paying their way, as he puts it in another piece, in another place. Now, the typical response of the realist to Rorty's assertions about relativism is, look, I just can't believe you're not a relativist. This is all relativism. Because the realist thinks that truth has to have a nature. It has to have a permanent, fixed nature, right? Truth must be true in some sense. And the realist believes that there's an objective view of reality, a correspondence picture of how our words hook up with the world, how our ideas hook up with reality, that must be the case. Another way of seeing relativism as a kind of incommensurability. And Rorty wants to distance himself from this view too. It's a bit more subtle, sometimes referred to as semantic relativism. And this is the view that holds that incommensurability between different cultures and different languages is inevitable. Right? True and good could mean something in different cultures, among different peoples in the world, and cultural disagreements can never be reconciled because the disputing parties are just going to point to the meanings that they attach to different concepts, and there's going to be no way to get them together. And here, I don't think we need to go into this, but Rorty follows Donald Davidson's argument that there's no real problem of incommensurability because we could never know when a term in another language is untranslatable, right? And because our interpretive scheme is that we go by our own lights, this is all we have, this has just got to be enough. And we should resist thinking of rationality as the application of some kind of neutral criteria that transcends all cultures, right? We should think of rationality as a way that we reweave or rewrite our model of things so that it works better. Now, there's another neo-pragmatist, Hilary Putnam, who also resists Rorty's approach. Putnam believes that there has to at least be public criteria for settling arguments. There has to be some ideal terminus to inquiry. Right? And this is a very Peircean kind of view. So while Putnam would agree with Rorty that there's no God's eye view to what's true and what's justified, there has to be some kind of limit, a Grenzbegriff, right? We might call it universal transcultural rationality, or we might call it transhistorical nature. Right? We might call it the transcendental conditions of communication. Right? There are a lot of different labels or ways to construe it. But Rorty is not going to have any of this Putnam stuff. Right? Rorty says we've got to get rid of all that. There's no more God's eye view. There's no more perspective from a spectatorial standpoint of the divine, right, or from nature. Putnam, in this Grenzbegriff, this limit idea, is sliding back into scientism, right? This is the view that science has a kind of superior, above-it-all perspective, and that's exactly the perspective we have to get rid of once and for all, in all of its possible forms. Indeed, Rorty says, look, such ultimate limits or criteria aren't even helpful. They're not even necessary, right? Human inquiry proliferates. It goes to different problems at different times among different people. It finds problems to solve, and it either works or it doesn't. And there's no reason to insist that in order to be legitimate, it has to somehow, some way, somewhere converge. So Putnam's limit talk confines us to aiming at a kind of pre-prepared target rather than being innovative, creative, inventive about problem solving. And this is what Rorty thinks is ultimately damaging about Putnam's approach.